Hello, students. Let's talk about Chapter 4, the socio-emotional development of infants. So I will open up those slides as I share the screen. All right, you should see that now, and let's make it bigger. All right, so let's talk about socio-emotional development in infancy. So this is the second part of our discussion on infancy. The first part, and I mentioned this before, but every chapter, every couple chapters from now on, we'll talk about physical and cognitive development in one chapter for any given life stage, like adolescence, early adulthood, that kind of thing. And then the second chapter will then be socio-emotional development in that same life stage. So today, socio-emotional development in infancy. So we'll be covering things like emotional development, obviously, temperament, attachment, social orientation, family, as well as childcare. Because all of these things are relevant to how a child develops socially and emotionally in the world. So, what is an emotion? Well, you might have seen Inside Out. Here we've got some emotions like joy, sadness, and anger. That's not really what emotions are like. Emotions are defined as a feeling or an affect that occurs when a person is in a state of interaction that's important to self and well being. So, some positive emotions you're probably aware of: joy, love, enthusiasm. Negative emotions are things like anger, anxiety, guilt, and sadness. So, these are feelings or an aspect of affect that can happen when we're in a state of something happening. So if we're being threatened, we might feel anxiety. If something really good happens within our context, we might feel love or joy. So that's what emotion is. And emotion is really important in our communication. So if I'm looking really angry as I'm communicating to someone, or looking really happy, it kind of changes the dynamics of that conversation, right? So it's important in communication. It's important in our social interactions with the world. And infants, they come out without knowing how we use emotions, what maybe faces look like, right? So infants communicate through their lives with a lot of emotions. So they learn behaviors that are adaptive through social responses driven by emotion. So if they are upset, if they're sad because they're hungry, they might display an emotional response, and then they might be taken care of. They learn that that works to get them food or a nap or um, cuddling or something like that. And then other things like joy might inspire a parent to interact with the child more. So if a child is smiling, the parent might be more excited about interacting with that child. So that's that bidirectional relationship. If the child is learning that that's adaptive and they get more attention when they're acting joyful, they might tend to act more joyful later on as well. So we talked about neurology a lot last time. So a lot of emotion is influenced and kind of focused in the brainstem, the hippocampus, and amygdala. These all play a role in emotions. So we might get sensory information from our bodies that travels through some of these systems. We might send messages from our prefrontal cortex down and charge emotions up. Hormones in our body can lead to other emotions being more or less likely to occur. So the regulation of emotions comes through the development of that prefrontal cortex. So that like front part of the forehead right here. So that most highly evolved part of our brain, we can learn to regulate our emotions. So again, this area of the brain, that prefrontal cortex, doesn't finish its myelination. So the insulation of the axons of neurons, it doesn't finish that until about age 23. And so because of that, children versus adolescents versus adults all have different capacities for controlling their emotions. So as an example, my 3-year-old got really upset about not getting a popsicle after dinner. So this happened just tonight. So started crying, getting really upset because his sister did get a popsicle because she had finished her dinner. So she got the popsicle. He didn't finish his dinner, so he was really upset about it. So one thing that I sometimes do is grab a book that's called Little Monkey Calms Down. It's a pretty good book. Like, feel free to go and check it out and see if it's useful. but it goes through the little monkey's mad and sad because he dropped his ice cream on the ground, and it goes through, well, the little monkey takes breaths, it cuddles with its blankie, it plays, and then it's happy after that. So that is about the level that he's able to do of regulating his own emotions. For my daughter, who's 6 or 7, oops, 7, when she gets upset, I can just say, hey, take a breath, do some tapping. And what that is she basically just slowly takes breaths as she thinks about raising her hands slowly and putting them back down slowly. So focusing on something else as an emotional regulation strategy. And the 3-year-old can't quite do those yet. So part of that is that prefrontal cortex versus me as an adult. I should be a lot better than I am at, say, regulating my own emotions. So this picture, I don't remember the original reason I put this here because we're talking about infancy, but I put pictures of adolescence here. But this link, definitely not relevant to your exam or anything in the class, but it's a funny kind of story about Stock University, or the Stock Photo University. So go check that out if you have a couple minutes to spare as a break. So I'll probably go and look at it again now that it's up on my screen after I finish recording this lecture. So with that, we do have a lot of biological, cognitive, and environmental influence on our emotions. So hormones are one of those biological features, also the neurons, the influence of the environment and what we feel is happening in the environment. So as the frontal lobe and prefrontal cortex, children can start to develop these cognitive strategies to regulate their emotions. For really young children, distraction is a really good way to help them regulate their emotion. So if they're really upset about something, a toy is broken or they can't reach it, distracting them with another toy can be a really useful thing. This can even work well even up to like age 9 or 10. So distract away from the negative experience or distract towards a positive experience can be really useful. The foundation for developing an attachment to parents is found within a lot of emotions. So families that are laughing together versus arguing together, happy and positive interactions will lead to more positive emotions and a reinforcement about those positive things. Some researchers have called it a positive upward spiral. So essentially, if you're having positive interactions with the people around you, in this case, an infant with their caregivers a lot of the time, then that is going to be reinforcing for the infant. They will try to do behaviors like smiling more, which makes it a little more likely that the parent will respond positively. And then more and more and more positive things are happening. So a positive upward spiral. So children can become better at managing their emotions through really sensitive caregiving. So things like giving children hugs, for example, can help their bodies decrease this hormone levels because they don't have the cognitive capacities to realize that they're stressed yet and that they need to calm down. So giving them a hug automatically tells the body like stress levels down and starts to train the brain and the neurology on how to calm itself. Because essentially, um, feel free to look at a lot of things by Darcia Narvaez. She's a really good researcher that focuses a lot on childhood and adolescence, some aspects of moral development. And she talks in this paper, well, she's got a research lab and does a lot of really good research, but she's also really good at writing research in ways that lay people can understand. So I can understand the research papers and some of the big silly words that are used sometimes in those, but she also writes most of her findings in these blog posts in different places. So she has her own blog that she publishes the research on in a more easy to digest way. So here's a link to one of these. Essentially, the point of this specific article is that crying it out for children is really bad. So it doesn't actually help teach them to calm down. It just teaches them to stop doing the behavior because they know they're never going to get help. So they become, it's learned helplessness essentially, is crying it out. So a better thing to do is take care of the child, comfort them. It can be really hard and frustrating, but that actual act of, say, picking up a child and giving them a hug and talking to them and helping them calm down starts to train both their body and their brain on how to do that by itself, because they're not cognitively capable of doing that by themselves yet. So with that, a variety of settings help infants develop a rich variety of emotions. So without experiencing different emotions, it's really hard to learn how to regulate them. So if a child never experienced sadness, it would be really hard for them to regulate that sadness. So this is a funny little clip that I think we will watch really quickly. Joy from Inside Out is essentially trying to stop sadness from doing anything, to stop the character Riley from feeling sadness at all. So let's see if this works. Hopefully the audio is better for this video. Oh no, I should have double checked that video. I checked the more important ones that they were still working. This video is no longer working. Essentially the point is that the emotion joy is trying to stop the character Riley from experiencing sadness at all. So that's not great. Obviously, if an ice cream falls on the ground or you're not able to get a popsicle or something like that, as an infant, you probably shouldn't be giving popsicles. But just as an example, it's all right to experience those emotions. It's okay for children to have those things, to experience things like joy, sadness, even anger and fear and disgust. So within the first 6 months, it seems like those emotions, oh, you can't see what I'm trying to show. Oops. There we go. So it seems like in the first 6 months of life, that surprise, joy, sadness, anger, fear, disgust are innate, that those are already there. They're pre-programmed into our biology and our neurology. Then within the first 2 years, we see evidence of things like jealousy, empathy. There's actually evidence of empathy even in the first days of life too, but also embarrassment, pride, shame, and guilt. So these are early emotions that children can experience. Self-conscious emotions, things that require a self-awareness, a sense of I or me as being separate from the mother, may not exist until closer to about 1 year of age, because children at that age, it's not clear if they understand that they are a separate being from other people around them, that they are their own individual person. So the development of empathy is a really, really interesting one. It's one that is very important to my research in prosocial behavior and heroism. So this is a great video to watch on the development of empathy. We're not going to watch it in class together, but great one to watch if you want to know a little bit more about empathy and how there are signs of empathy existing even in the first moments of life. So if you take two babies that are just fine and one starts crying, the other baby nearby often will start crying as well. And if you put like EEGs and look at their brain activity, it's because they are literally feeling the same feelings, or they're starting to feel similar feelings at least, as that other baby. So empathy is a two-part thing. One, you're feeling what someone else is feeling, and two, you're able to put yourself in that person's shoes. So very, very little infants can do that process of feeling what someone else is feeling. So it's easier for them to do that with people around their own age. Same with children like age 3. It's easier for them to empathize with people around their age, but they can, at that point, do a much better job at cognitively placing themselves in someone else's shoes. So other oral emotions like guilt, anger, and empathy are developing at this time as well. There's actually a question paper example that I wrote about these kinds of moral emotions. So you might say, oh, anger and guilt, like how are those moral things? Well, guilt is considered a moral emotion because when a person feels guilt, they tend to want to fix that guilt, to fix whatever they broke or who they hurt, apologize or fix the problem. So the other day, for example, I was trying to toss my son's, like he has this little blue plastic magic wand that he's been playing with a lot. And so I was trying to get it out of this room so I could put it away, like where it goes. But I didn't throw it carefully. And so it hit the wall and it broke. It broke in half. And I felt really, really guilty because it's been one of his favorite toys. So I felt guilt, and it motivated me to try and do something pro-social, to try and fix that. I couldn't actually fix it. I tried a lot of super glue. It didn't stick together, so I just bought him a new one. Um, and then I felt a little bit better about myself. So that's an example of how guilt can be motivating to do moral actions. All right, so emotional expressions in social relationships are really important. So seeing a adult's emotions as you're talking to them. For an infant, there are different kinds of crying that they do. So basic cry, anger cry, pain cry. If you're around an infant frequently, you will probably recognize that, oh, they're hungry or, oh, they're mad about something. So a basic cry in research is a rhythmic pattern usually. It's a cry with a brief silence, and then a short whistled high pitched, a short whistle that's a little higher pitched than the main cry, and then a brief rest before the next like cry. Anger cry is a little bit different. It's got a lot more forceful airs through vocalizing. Then a pain cry is often very sudden, loud, and long. And often there's breath holding either right before or after any given cry. So I'm not going to give an example, like try to mimic that. Maybe I should find some videos of that, but it sounds kind of depressing to watch children cry in the class. So actually, I'm not going to find videos on that. Just that sounds really depressing. But hopefully, the main point here is that when you are interacting with infants, if you are doing it enough, you should be able to figure out, well, are they angry? Are they in pain? Um, and for older children too. So my 3-year-old was running around the house. I was like, should slow down. You're going to get hurt. Don't go in the kitchen. You're going to bonk your head or something. And all of a sudden, I hear a cry, kind of like the pain cry. So kind of a, and look, there I go, trying to mimic a cry with some breath holding, and it's a lot louder or longer. So I know, oh, he did just hurt himself. Just needed a little ice pack for a little while, and he was fine. So similarly, there's different kinds of smiles. There's a reflexive smile, which is a smile that doesn't occur in response to any external stimuli. It's just smiling at random. Babies often do this, and it's endearing. It's something that parents or caregivers or other people say, oh, they're smiling, and they might think that they are smiling at them. They might not be. They might be as well, though, because there is a social smile, which is in response to external stimuli. And so that is a really reinforcing one. It helps teach a child that smiling is something that other people like, they get more attention, those kinds of things. Stranger anxiety might appear in children at around 6 months of age. And so that's that fear and wariness of strangers, not wanting to be passed to someone new. There might also be separation protests, which is a lot of distressed crying when a caregiver leaves. So if you've ever babysat a young child and they just won't stop crying, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. So over the first year, infants start to develop the ability to inhibit or minimize the intensity of their emotions. They do other behaviors to try and, you might say, distract themselves or to calm themselves down, like thumb sucking or maybe even talking to themselves when they get to closer to around 20 months old. So infants really do depend, so very young infants especially, really depend on the caregiver to reduce their arousal level. So comforting them, holding them like in this picture, talking to them softly, playing with them, distracting them with other things, that helps them learn what their body should do when they feel those kinds of feelings to then calm down. So again, I'm going to point out Darcia Narvaez's work. Feel free to look at that blog and find a lot of good information. You'll probably find a lot of articles that are useful if you're working with kids, if you have your own children, those kinds of things. So the context mattered too. So I notice my children get really a lot more grumpy, a lot more irritable and angry at each other if they're tired or hungry. So depending on the different location, it might be hard on them to be at the grandparents' house or something like that. So this hunger grump example is kind of what I was saying. My children get really grumpy when they're hungry. And so they're old enough now that I'm like, hey, you're being a hunger grump. You should eat some food. Kind of like those Snickers commercials. You're not you when you're hungry, grab a Snickers. So Snickers is one of my favorite candy bars, but I don't think I've ever bought one because of those commercials, but a good relevant example for this class. So with that, that is also, there are other contexts that matter for the emotions of children, such as if a mother of a child has suffered from depression, especially if it's during the time of infancy. So if a mother is suffering from depression early on, they will tend to do things like rocking and soothing a baby less. And that can lead to more downward spirals. So if they're not soothing the baby's not learning to regulate their own emotions well. That leads to less effective coping strategy. It makes the child more at risk for depression in the future. And that's partially based on the child's experience. It's also a little bit based on genes as well. So that nature and nurture, both of those things. So let's talk about temperament. So temperament, when we're talking about infants, is kind of like an infant personality. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar enough that I think it might be a way for you to understand it. Essentially, it's the way a child tends to respond to things. And there's a couple different categories. One's an easy child temperament, difficult child temperament, and slow to warm up child temperament. So an easy child is a pretty easy child to get along with. They generally have a positive mood. They quickly establish, this is a big key here, is that they quickly establish routines in infancy, and they can adapt and change up those routines without many negative outcomes, like not feeling too grumpy or not feeling too sad, not getting too stressed. They're more open to new experiences. So let's say you have an infant who's going over to grandma's for the first time and they're going to have to sleep there for 2 nights. So an easy child would be able to pretty quickly adapt to that new environment, sleep at around the normal time, and not be too upset, have a similar feeding schedule still. Versus a difficult child, they react more negatively and cry more frequently, and they have, at the beginning, irregular daily routines just in general. And then if they're the ones that go to grandma's, it's a lot harder for them to adapt to that change, to create a new routine. So they might not sleep at the right times, they might not feed at the right times. And so that altogether can make it for a more difficult time for a parent parenting this child. A slow to warm up child, you might say, well, let's just read the kind of academic definition first. So generally they have a lower activity level. They don't do too much. They're somewhat negative, but not necessarily crying, kind of a low intensity of mood. So they might be able to reestablish routines, but you might, if you have, say, um, a nephew or a niece that just kind of doesn't do much, you might say, oh, they're kind of boring. Like, don't say that to their parents. That's a really bad idea. But if you ever thought that about a child, they might have a slow to warm up temperament. So, with that, there's other behavioral inhibitions in addition to temperaments. So these are more modern ways of looking at temperaments. So we've got shy, subdued, and timid child, those that might be more sociable or extroverted, being a bold child. So inhibited children tend to have a higher risk for developing anxiety disorders in adolescent and adulthood, versus the sociable, extroverted, or bold child. So with that, there are other categorizations like the Rothar and Bates classifications of extroversion slash surgency, negative affectivity, and effortful control. So with that, what that's talking about is the extroversion and surgency is the activity level and laughter and observational measures. So if you're watching and observing these kids, they'll be more active, they might laugh more, versus someone that you would classify as having negative affectivity would be an infant or a young child that has more sadness or discomfort while you're observing them. And then effortful control is a really good base for self-regulation. Um, so Rothar and Bates would say a child who is regulating their emotions, that's slow to anger, that's regulating themselves, it has an effortful control as kind of their temperament. One good thing about Rothar and Bates is that their categories, they didn't assume that these were fixed forever, versus previous models of that easy, difficult, and slow to warm up child. Those were kind of assumed to just be the way that child was going to be forever. So in more recent times, we realized that, well, depending on the context, depending on the new interactions with parents, if a parent, say, had some postpartum depression, but then got treatment for that, they might now be interacting with the child differently. So the child might now have a more easy temperament or have that more extroversion and surgency as their classification. The key is that any kind of context, especially parental context, so the parental settings, can impact and are impacted by child's temperament. So the temperament of the child will affect how the parent interacts with them, and the child and the parent interacting will then affect the child's temperament. So another important thing with social emotional development in infancy is figuring out a sense of self. It seems that by about 2 years of age, that children do have a pretty solid sense that they are an individual, that they have their own self. But even up to about a year old, it doesn't seem that they necessarily have that sense that they are their own unique individual, separate from the other people around them. So one thing that you can do to test this in children is really interesting. You can put a dot on a child's nose or head when they're, say, a year old, put them in front of a mirror and see if they touch the dot on the mirror or if they touch the dot on their own head. So if they're touching it on their own head, they realize that person in the mirror is me versus that person in the mirror might be someone else. So again, it's hard to really get a sense of, does a child have a sense that they are their own unique individual? So we use these kinds of observational methods to get some idea of that. So how might this experiment be related to neurology and brain development that's happening at that time in between years 1 and 2? So take a minute to think about that. You can even pause this and think about that. Maybe read over your notes from our neurology section. All right, so let's move forward to attachment. So this is actually, we're going to cover a lot of content on attachment right now, and you actually have a discussion board assignment this week about attachment. So what is the relevance of the monkey in this picture? Well, that monkey in this experiment, so try and recall what this experiment was. So what this experiment was that they took young monkeys and they set them up with two mothers in cages. So one mother had a cloth on it and usually like a light bulb or a heat source underneath it. So it was like warm and fuzzy. The other mother was just like wire. It wasn't soft. The baby was able to hang off of it, and it had nipples with milk. So the tiny monkey could get fed from one of the mothers, but then the other one is where they could get some cuddling essentially. And so what they saw is that the baby monkeys tended to prefer the cuddly, warm monkey rather than the one that would just feed them. So this was important in the early days of looking at attachment and the socio-emotional development of children. There was a lot of ideas that a child would become attached to whatever was feeding it. So if you had, say, a robot monkey feeding the child, they would become attached to that robot monkey because they're giving them their sustenance that they need to live. But in reality, a lot of mammals, like social connection, need to bond to other people. And so attachment is that close bond between two people. Most studies of attachment are done with the child and the mother. There are some with child and father. There's attachment studies of child and siblings, grandparents, other caregivers. But that's what attachment is, that bond between the child and other people. And this has relevance all throughout life. So your attachment style does stay pretty consistent on average. So most people that are watching this lecture, about 70% of you probably have the same attachment style now that you developed early on in infancy. But attachment styles can change. So for that other 30%, it can change over time. So what are the different attachment styles and how do we develop attachments? So from about birth to 2 months, here we've got up here, infants direct their attachment towards human figures, those people around them that are caring for them. It tends to become focused on one figure. Usually that's the primary caregiver. In most studies, this is the mother. Then from about 7 to 27 months, specific attachments develop towards specific other caregivers as well. And then from about 2 years and on, children become aware of their own feelings, their own goals, and are aware of themselves as an individual. So that is kind of how attachment starts to develop. So, how we study attachment in young children is through the strange situation. You've read this in your book, I hope, by this point. And the strange situation is an observational way to measure how an infant is attached to their caregiver, if they're securely attached, insecurely attached. One good way to do this is to go into a home, watch an infant interact with their caregiver. But since you don't have that much time that you could always do that with every single research subject, you can bring them in, do the strange situation test, and get a pretty good idea. So, how this goes is the child and the caregiver come into a room. They play together for a little while, and then a stranger comes in. So, usually a research member. They come in, they might talk to the parent, they might not. Then, after a little while, the parent leaves, generally without really talking to the child. They just kind of leave. And then you look for both the interactions with when the parent is there, as well as what does the child do when the parent leaves. Do they care at all? If they're indifferent, that might suggest something. If the child is really upset, that might suggest something. And then in a little while, the caregiver comes back. So in this case, the mother comes back. And you see, well, how does that child then interact with that mother? Does the child calm down immediately? Does it take a little bit of prompting? Does it take a lot of prompting to help that child calm down? Does the child care at all that the parent came back? So that's all indicative of what kind of attachment this child might have. And then usually the parent will leave the child alone again, and then the stranger will come back in. So that'll give you a good sense of how this child is attached to this primary caregiver. So for secure attachment, what we generally see is that when they come into the room, the child uses the caregiver as a secure base. They will go maybe explore some toys, come back to the parent, or look at the parent to make sure it's safe to do other things. They'll explore the room and play. They might cry when the parent leaves, but when the parent comes back, they will quickly reestablish a positive connection to the caregiver and often go back to playing. So they won't be too upset for too long once the parent comes back. Insecure avoidant attachment, they will show a lot of insecurity by even avoiding the caregiver when the caregiver first brings them into the room. They might have very little interaction with the caregiver. They might not even care when the caregiver leaves. They might show no crying or like they didn't care that the caregiver left. So you might do this kind of study with like a 3 or a 4-year-old, maybe even older 2-year-old. And usually for an insecure avoidant child, they won't try to reestablish contact when the parent returns. They might look, but then move away. If the parent comes up to them, they might go and play with something else. So that's insecure avoidant. They're avoiding that caregiver. And you might imagine something in their home life that leads them to think that they can't be securely attached to this caregiver. So insecure resistant is similar. It's also insecure, but they're trying to cling to the caregiver, but they also might want to resist that closeness. So when they come in, they might not want to go explore toys at all. They might want to stay close, but then if they are playing, they might then resist the caregiver coming over to them. They often don't explore the toys in the room, and they'll cry really, really loudly and be very distressed at the caregiver leaving. And they often have a really hard time being soothed and comforted when the caregiver comes back. So they care a lot that it's left, but when the caregiver returns, they still are not calming down. So you might imagine that maybe this child hasn't had a lot of experience with consistent and responsive caregiving. Maybe this child has learned over time that the caregiver isn't always going to be there for them. They want that attachment, but the caregiver is not always going to be there for them. And then the last one, you don't need to know this one too much because it's pretty rare. It's insecure disorganized. So it's kind of disorganized and disoriented within the strange situation. The child might appear kind of dazed and confused. They might show some avoidance patterns and some resistance behaviors, but it is a very rare attachment style. It probably won't come up in your test, but it does exist. So why are we talking about this? Why are these aspects of attachment to a caregiver and siblings, other caregivers, why is this important? Well, it's important because it reflects on the parent-infant relationships, that bidirectional interaction. So a secure attachment leads to more easier secure attachment even later in life. So people who have secure attachments with their parents, even in infancy, they tend to find friends and partners later in life that also have a secure attachment, and they make a secure attachment with each other. So it's a really strong foundation for healthy socio-emotional development with friends all throughout life. So when you have a secure attachment, when you're getting responsive contact from a caregiver as an infant, you learn how to regulate your emotions in those attachment pairs. You start developing those neural pathways for interacting with people. Whereas if you're avoidant and you're not actually interacting with a caregiver very much, you're not going to learn those skills as quickly or as well. So secure attachment is really important. Like I said, most people, about 70% of people, keep their same attachment style throughout their whole life. For those who are insecurely attached, they might seek out partners who are also insecurely attached, because this is the kind of attachment that they're used to. They might expect that they can't fully rely on a partner, even if it's kind of subconscious. And so when you have two securely attached people in a partnership, and then two insecurely attached people in a partnership, I think you might be able to expect which one you might have a longer term relationship coming out of that. So that being said, if there's, say, someone with an insecure attachment that starts, let's say, dating someone with a secure attachment, that secure attachment behavior coming from that partner can help that person learn a secure attachment style. Can also happen if, let's say, a child is adopted at age 5 and the new parents, they have a secure attachment style that can change an attachment style. So it's not completely fixed for all of life. This is something that is relatively plastic. So here in these slides, these are for my in-person classes. There's a couple different videos that actually you'll use and watch for your discussion board. So I'm going to basically skip over those right now. But for your discussion board this week, you are going to look at some examples of secure or insecure attachment and see some videos of which kind of attachment you think those are. So this might be, well, maybe in like 2 minutes after I finish the discussion of attachment, this could be a good place to stop, go do your your initial post for your discussion board if you haven't already, or maybe go make some replies on that right now. So why is attachment important? Well, we just talked about people tend to seek out relationships that are of the similar kind of attachment style. So let's say you have maybe positive outcomes on this side of the Plinko board and negative outcomes on this side of the Plinko board. So a child who has a secure attachment has some things kind of nudging them in the positive directions. If they have an insecure attachment, maybe that's some things nudging them in the negative direction. That can change later in life. They might get a secure attachment or have a securely attached partner that they're with. And that can be a dramatic effect. But there's also other things happening within these contexts. And that's what we'll talk about next is social context. So a family is a complex system. So if you have 3 people in your family, if you have 2 people in your family, if you have 20 people in your family, you can see there's relationships between each of those people. You will affect them, they will affect you. The way you're interacting will affect the third or fourth or fifth member of that family, right? So each person is a relational developmental system. They are a system, they are an individual that they relate with other people, and their system, their biology, their neurology, their personality, their temperament, these all will influence how they interact with other people. So think about looking at that bidirectional interaction. So this is a different diagram that should give you that same kind of idea that we've talked about since week 1, essentially. So you can look at a child and a parent's relationship and the parent to the child, a child to the marriage relationship and the marriage relationship's influence on the child. So you might say, if the marriage relationship is maybe a little unhealthy, that might lead to different behaviors towards the child and the child to do different things towards the relationship. So essentially, any relational developmental system, any individual, a sibling, a grandparent to that child, and any other relational developmental system, any other individual will influence each other. And any child can influence their general context, the home, a school, maybe a preschool or a daycare, things like that. So some very important things is that parents tend to be the main socializers of their children. So child temperament might help determine parents' behavior. So if it's an easy child, parents might be a little nicer or more friendly or more fun with the child. But if it's a difficult child, they might be a little more stressed or short with that child. So, doing things like childproofing a house or providing an environment for an infant, that is aspects of the family social context. So, it's speaking with the child, doing things like we talked about in cognitive development, helping children's skills build by scaffolding them. If they can't quite pick up something, help them practice that, help them pick things up and move things around. Later on, help them learn to write and learn to read. Children will also change their parents. So that's what that bidirectional interaction means. The child is influencing the parent is influencing the child is going right back and influencing that parent. So a child will change a parent as well. So let's talk about childcare in the US, especially with infants. Many US children have multiple caregivers, and only over 2 million children receive formal licensed care. Most children, though, when we're talking outside the primary caregiver, which is usually defined as the mother, um, definitely a pet peeve for me as a father. It's like there's a lot less research on fathers and children and those contexts as there is on mothers and their children. So, as a father, it's like I really like more research on that. If you have an aunt or an uncle parenting a child or grandparents, there's even less research on those kinds of contexts. So, definitely an area where more work could be done if that's something you might be interested in researching in the future, or if it's something that might interest you to look up for your question papers. So many, many more children in the US are cared for by babysitters, family friends, grandparents. So let's talk first about quality formal childcare programs. So those things that you might be paying for to take a child to. Most children don't have quality formal non-parental care. So not just the fact that few are in it, but most care facilities aren't actually very high quality. Only 12% of research programs that were being evaluated in many, many studies were considered high quality. So if you want some more information, this might be a good start for a question paper. Here's some references that you could look up. So these different papers and reports will go into some really specific things that good high quality childcare will do. So what does quality early childcare mean? Well, there's low teacher to child ratios and small group sizes. So if you have one teacher to two children in a childcare situation versus one teacher to 10 children, you can see those two children are going to get a lot more individualized and focused attention. Their needs are going to be met a lot quicker and maybe a lot better than if they're in a group of 10. So giving age appropriate learning activities. So giving a 7-year-old blocks could be really relevant, but they might need something a little more complex, like maybe Lego bricks, versus an infant might need just rattles and some colors and things. So giving age appropriate learning activities is very important. Engaging in safe learning environments, having things that make them want to learn and are safe. Obviously, being physically safe is very important for any daycare. So doing activities that support both physical, social, and emotional growth. So playing games with other children really can help with physical development as well as working together as a team, that social interaction, and then also emotional growth. Hard things happen. You might fight over a toy or a ball or things like that. That can be good as it's monitored and supported from good, high quality professionals. So, having qualified staff with professional development opportunities, so they're still learning as they're working there, that is another really good sign that it's a high quality formal childcare program. So after talking about formal things, there are also other parental, oh, actually, I think that is the last slide. I think this next slide is one of my slides from a previous, yep, this is some of my extra slides. So, yep, that was the last little bit on social context that we'll focus on. Again, there's a little more of in your book, but especially with chapter 3 being a little bit longer, having chapter 4, and that kind of tends to be the case, is the socio-emotional development chapter is a little bit shorter. In general, we get through it a little bit quicker. But when we're covering physical as well as cognitive development, that's a lot of dense material to get through. So those lectures will tend to be a little bit longer. So those are usually the odd numbers, I believe, in the book, but double check that. So now you know a lot more about the development of infants. Hopefully this will be useful to you with any infants in your lives. Keep on track with your schedules. Check those often to make sure you know when things are coming up and do. Sometimes, for example, the due date on Canvas might say something's due on Saturday. It says this for most of the discussion boards. But if you look at your schedule, you'll see which day the first post is due. So it doesn't allow me to have double due dates for those, which is a little frustrating, but look over your schedule, maybe print it out, keep on track. So we will learn next time about a little bit further on in the life cycle of children. And we will continue learning about early childhood. There is a lot more material on early childhood and even middle childhood than there is necessarily on early adulthood. So these first couple chapters, there's quite a bit of material to read through and get through, but it's very good that we have this much research on early childhood. So have a good rest of your day, and good luck preparing for your upcoming exam as well.